Welcome back to Dawn of War Central, and today we've got some extra snippets of information. Well, I say snippets, but actually quite a lot of information to share with you all about the hugely anticipated Dawn of War 4. The info comes from the AMA, the Ask Me Anything session on the official Discord, and it revealed some pretty cool details and thoughts from the developers over at King Art Games. In particular, we had Jan Thaysen and Elliot to answer several questions. Jan Thaysen is one of the co-founders at King Art Games and is the King Art's creative director. He's also the Dawn of War 4 game director and has a hand in the narrative design, game design, and user interface. Elliot is a senior game designer at King Art Games, and he's been with the studio for 6 years. Now, as many of you will know, King Art Games were the developers of Iron Harvest, and the first question and answer draw from the developers' experience with that game and how things may shape up with Dawn of War 4 as a result. So Milky Mike asked the question, what is the biggest lesson that you've learned from Iron Harvest? And well, what are the main takeaways that you've learnt from developing the game that you did not know before that project? Elliot mentions that there are lots of lessons they've learned from Iron Harvest, and one that he believes stuck with him in particular was finding the right trade-off between impactful animations and unit responsiveness. He believes that they've reached a much better balance with Dawn of War 4. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting talking point, especially considering things like unit turn rates, melee combat detail, and sync kills for Dawn of War. Turn rates is usually actually something that does turn heads, because when it comes to units and their movements, you have games which really prioritize responsivity, and so their units often have a quick turn rate, as well as the game having high tick rates to ensure that your input commands change the unit directions very quickly. However, there are also other games where actually units having slower turn rates is designed that way on purpose as part of the unit's character, behavior, and charm. We have seen during the trailers that melee units essentially battle it out almost like an animated duel, and it actually raises the question of when these melee units engage, whether they can actually disengage, and if so, how quickly do they respond to those input commands to do so? In other words, can they still be responsive when in those melee duels? The answer to this is that in general, melee combat is kind of a big deal in Dawn of War 4. Units that focus on melee always have the disadvantage that they must reach the enemy before they can deal significant amounts of damage. To make them competitive, melee units on average deal more damage, but they also gave them the ability to bind enemies in melee. So when units fight in melee, they kind of stick together as long as one of the participating units wants to stay in that melee mode. For example, a weaker ranged unit can't just run away, and their melee units try to keep them engaged. This is pretty cool because what happens now is that players try to get their melee units in the melee combat with the enemy's strong ranged units. If they manage to reach them, the ranged units can't just use their most powerful weapons anymore, and they can't just run away either. So the player who controls the ranged unit might send one of their melee units to get the ranged unit out of trouble, and then the next time the player might try to intercept melee units before they reach their ranged units. All of this is very dynamic and offers lots of tactical options. Based on that answer, what's pretty cool as well is that if your ranged units are engaged in melee mode, you can send your own melee units to almost break that up and intervene, get involved. Now, the combat director system does actually make sure that you can leave combat though, as they've implemented many early outs and ways to abort animations. However, due to melee binding, there are gameplay reasons why you might not actually be able to leave combat quickly, at least with all your models, as long as you don't use retreat. Retreat actually forces an instant disengagement, but for that, you lose control over the units for a while, so that's like a trade-off, just like, well, everything should be. We then do also have sync kills, which are essentially finishing moves of units on others, where I guess units will probably be quite locked into the animation. There's no confirmation of this, but I guess another question is whether that animation can be cancelled, for example if the unit is taking shots from other units whilst enacting a sync kill. Now, Jan's answer to the question about what they've learnt from Iron Harvest is in terms of gameplay mission design. He mentions that they've looked at what's worked well for Iron Harvest. They wanted all missions to be around 45 minutes as a general rule, but for Dawn of War, it looks like they are fine with some short missions and some epic missions, essentially whatever the campaign stage and the story demands. So I really quite like the approach here for Dawn of War, because for me at least, all the RTS games that I've loved to play over the years, games like Age of Empires and Command & Conquer, well, they've always had varying missions in both difficulty, complexity, and actual mission length. I found that this mixes things up in the campaign, and the variability keeps things fresh and organic with the storyline. It means some missions have different strategic focuses, rather than all missions being one big battlefield slog. Now, when it comes to campaigns, Haldron44 asked whether the choices have an overall impact on the story ending, or if they are just mission specific. And what we found out was that the overarching narrative of the campaigns are linear, but your story choices will impact narrative elements within the campaign in question. It will also affect the choice of missions that you'll have to play, and there are some choices that have longer reaching consequences, but many of the really impactful things are in the individual campaigns. You can often pick between commanders during campaigns, giving you a very different experience in those missions. Keeping on the topic of campaigns, Croax raised the question of how the co-op dimension of the game will be structured. Will it be a separate campaign, a single-player campaign for multiple players, or specially designed missions? And will the co-op dimension require each player to play as the same faction? So it turns out for cooperative campaigns, you and a friend control the same army and play through the single-player missions together, so you can imagine it being closer to the Archon mode of StarCraft 2, rather than the campaigns of, for example, Red Alert 3. Now, we know we have commanders in Dawn of War 4, but the question was asked whether there will be equipment upgrades for the commanders throughout the campaign, and if so, will it be like Dawn of War Dark Crusade, where you get allocated equipment points to unlock better weapons or armor, or will it be like Dawn of War 2, where you get equipment from missions as drops? Or could it be even something entirely new? The answer is that you will unlock gear and abilities for heroes throughout the campaign, as well as stratagems, which are powerful off-map abilities. The stratagems unlock once, and then you can use them for the rest of the campaign. There are gear and abilities that you have to equip for every mission, and the idea is that based on the mission, you'll want to use different gears and abilities. So for example, if the mission is all about killing hordes of enemies on the field or defending a position, you might want to use different loadouts. Now, you can change these loadouts during missions as well, but changing your loadout always costs resources. So essentially, you unlock options as you go, but you start every mission with just your basic loadout, and then you can pick whatever works best in the mission, or essentially, whatever is your favorite. Now, switching things up a bit from the campaign to multiplayer, we've had Roman with the question of whether there are plans to underscore or influence a potential competitive scene. He feels like the campaign will definitely suck people in, but the multiplayer is what will keep the longevity of a game. Now, I very much agree with this, but bear in mind that the Last Stand game mode is coming back to Dawn of War 4, it's the cooperative mode as well, so that I think is going to have a big influence, not just the competitive multiplayer, I would say. In any case, as the question was asked, Elliot mentions that from his point of view, several games with long-lasting competitive scenes got their start because players were, well, invested in the world and the characters of the game. So for example, StarCraft comes to mind. The developers are really focusing on creating a game that's faithful to the look and feel of Warhammer 40k, but they do intend on offering a variety of multiplayer game modes and features at launch. Keep an eye out for more information in the future, is what they've answered. On the focus of multiplayer though, Jan does also add that he sees things like this. if a game becomes an esport title or not isn't really up to its developer or publisher, it's up to the players. He feels that they can do certain things to make it more likely, for example, of course, having good balancing and some necessary features, but they can't force it and it's not their goal. They say that they will try to make a game that is fun and fair in multiplayer, and they will see then what happens. So of course, I think this is a relatively sensible answer. What I would say though, that more often than not, a lot of games don't actually do what's necessary in terms of features. So I hope those features do exist. For example, well, there's good balancing, but then there's also an observer mode and also replay sharing functionality. I think without these two features, well, it's going to be very difficult to facilitate any esports, whether the community really want it or not. Because, well, if you have no ability to share games, then it's very difficult for casters to do offline events. And of course, without a good spectator mode, well, it's all about the spectators, isn't it? So speaking of balance, by the way, with multiplayer, it brings the question of whether there will be a dedicated balance team or not. This question was indeed asked, to which the answer was, of course they do have extensive in-house testing, but they also believe that a game like Dawn of War 4 is too complicated to balance alone. So they are hoping to profit from getting many eyes on the game before release, which they say they can tell you more about soon. Interesting answer here, because maybe it's hinting at possible closed beta testing. I certainly hope so, and I certainly hope I get an invite. Now, morale is not going to be included in Dawn of War 4, and here's why. One of the goals for the developers with Dawn of War 4 is to create an authentic Warhammer 40k experience. With that in mind, they critically assessed which mechanics from previous games still worked thematically for the factions and which didn't. The real question is, would it feel right if Terminators could be intimidated by suppressive fire? Would it make sense for Necron warriors to have morale that could be broken? They decided to focus on creating mechanics that align more closely with the unique aspects of each faction brought to the tabletop versions. Now, just an anecdote from behind the scenes with this, they had a long list of things like morale, but also environmental effects like poison, fire, and so on. They went into a game design meeting with this long list, all excited, and then basically killed every idea, because as soon as they thought about it, it was always like, well, Necrons would mind the fire, wouldn't they? And Space Marines, well, they can't really be poisoned, can they? And Orcs, well, they wouldn't run away from a fight just because they're frightened. So they basically decided not to take this route because there are so many factions not really bothered by a lot of these things. Now, for me personally, a big question is modding and whether it will be supported officially. Unfortunately though, the answer to this one right now, however, is it's a topic close to many of the developers' hearts, but sadly, they aren't ready to share more information on this topic yet, but it's on their radar. I super duper hope they have modding. It was a huge part of the early Dawn of War games, and well, it just helps the community make the game for the developers, well, at least take it further with some new game modes, maps, maybe even units, who knows. But what we do know is that when it comes to economy in Dawn of War 4, the devs are mixing old systems with new twists. Requisition will have upkeep as an optional setting in skirmish and multiplayer, keeping army sizes in check for those who want extra layers of strategy. Power works much like in Dawn of War 2, where you'll capture points and build generators on them to fuel your war machine. Each faction also plays differently. Orcs build war banners and fight to grow their war, unlocking units and stratagems at certain thresholds with big cooldowns instead of spending command points. Necrons, on the other hand, expand their domain across the map like Zerg creep from StarCraft. The more ground they cover, the stronger they get, earning resources and buffs for units fighting within their territory. While resource point decay isn't planned, iteration is the name of the game, and the economy is being fine-tuned to create a system that feels unique, dynamic, and true to the Warhammer 40k battlefield. Stealth in Dawn of War 4 is all about timing and positioning. Units with stealth stay invisible until they attack or wander into an enemy's detection range. Once they are revealed though, they are not completely helpless, they actually take reduced damage from ranged fire, giving them a fighting chance. Unlike previous games, there aren't any dedicated detector units this time around. Instead, every unit has the ability to uncover stealth, making awareness and micro crucial. Some factions may also gain special upgrades tied to stealth, opening the door for unique tricks and ambush tactics across the battlefield. Veterancy in Dawn of War 4 rewards units for surviving and fighting on the battlefield. As they gain experience through combat, they level up, boosting their health and damage output. Some units even unlock new war gear or abilities as they grow, and while all factions share the core system, certain armies place a much heavier emphasis on veterancy to truly shine. When it comes to idle animations and voice lines, Dawn of War 4 is planning for both these things that may even change depending on whether a match is progressing in your favour or not. Now, in Dawn of War 1, unit statistics were relatively bare bones when it came to unit tooltips, but plans in Dawn of War 4 are that they'll be showing a selection of statistics in the UI and the tooltips. They haven't settled on all the exact stats quite yet, but you can expect at least unit health, armor penetration, experience, veterancy level, and bullet points briefly describing the unit's key characteristics. Speaking of units, by the way, there aren't actually any plans for buildable transport units in Dawn of War 4, but the factions will still have their own unique ways to move units around the map quickly. So lots of things unpacked today, things about campaign, multiplayer, cooperative game modes. Lots of opinions I imagine will be flying around about the answers. There's no transport units. I'm a little bit concerned about the modding situation, but I guess time will tell on that one. So I think there's some real big positives and maybe some things I'm still a bit wary about. Let me know what you think about the game and the reveals today in the comment section below. Is it positive? Is it negative? What are you concerned about? Looking forward to reading your comments. But as always, a special shout out to the YouTube channel members. And if you haven't already, by the way, make sure you are subscribed because I will be hoping to keep you all updated about Dawn of War 4 in the future. As always, take care and see you next time.